Millions of Americans celebrated Martin Luther King Jr. Day on Monday, and the world joined them in witnessing the country's 47th president, Donald J. Trump, and Vice President J.D. Vance be sworn in. In his inauguration speech, President Donald Trump says that January 25th, 2025 is Liberation Day. In that same speech, he also acknowledged the work of Dr. King, saying, "Today is Martin Luther King Day, and his honor, this will be a great honor. But in his honor, we will strive together to make his dream a reality. We will make his dream come true." Today on our panel discussion, we have some amazing guests. First is Barry Griffin, Senator and Attorney at Law, DeAndra Cartwright, former diplomat and international relations specialist, I.A. Nicholas Mitchell, Attorney at Law, and Tony Grant, Investment Manager. Hi, guys.
Hey. Hey, how's it going? How are you?
I'm good. Welcome back to DeAndra and Senator Griffin. It's great to have you back on the panel. And welcome to Nicholas and Tony.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Awesome. You guys ready?
Yes, we are.
So I want to start off with a question that a lot of Bahamians want to know. And that is, why wasn't the Prime Minister of the Bahamas invited to the inauguration? Just to clear that up. Or was he invited?
I guess I'll take this one since I was going to say, I think we should defer to the senator on this one. To be honest, I'm not sure whether or not the Prime Minister was invited, but as you would note from the news stories, the inauguration was actually taken from outdoors where it usually fits a larger crowd, and it was brought indoors. And so the number of people who actually attended the inauguration was much less than in years past. And so even if a number of world leaders had been invited, it would have been sort of almost impossible to host all of them. We did see some foreign leaders in the audience. For example, I saw Boris Johnson of the UK, former Prime Minister of the UK, who was an ally of Donald Trump in his first term. And so obviously some were there, but just sort of strategically, I think we would have noted that, a number of world leaders were not present, in addition to a number of Americans who would normally attend these events were not present, simply for the fact that the amount of persons who were able to be fit in-house was much smaller than normal.
That's a great point. And I want to take it back to your point of what we normally see at an inauguration or during a transition of power. I want to go back to when President Joe Biden entered the White House. And what we saw, that transition of power was not as smooth as it was this time. What are your thoughts in regards to the Democrats ensuring that this time around that everything went well in regards to transferring over that power?
Well, I don't know that the Democrats really actuated that. The transfer of power was a little tumultuous last time because obviously the now president of the U.S. sort of incited an insurrection. The Democrats don't seem to have that sort of thing on their agenda. So without the actual, person who decided to perpetrate it the first time being there could only be a smooth transition of power. But, that's just my opinion. How factual that is, I'm not sure. Mm-hmm. Maybe they're planning some form of minor coup d'etat after the fact for dramatic effect. Who knows?
Yep. But, even from the perspective of the Bahamas, a peaceful transition of power is one of the key tenets of democracy. In the Bahamas here, we're all very proud of the fact that from election to election, there's always a peaceful transition of power. And so I think, as Nicholas would have said, I think it's almost a testament to the Democrats that, Joe Biden or Kamala Harris didn't, stage a coup or didn't decide not to attend any parts of the inauguration. In fact, even in watching some parts of the inauguration yesterday, Kamala Harris was even clapping at certain points and smiling, and I knew it probably took a lot out of her to do that. But, for the larger vision of a country and democracy, these are the kind of things that you need to do. Yeah.
Bringing it home here, and this is to anybody that wants to answer. When it comes to a transition of power here in the Bahamas, I've seen jokes on Facebook that says you leave your key in the office for your car, or you make sure your desk clean out. For us, how does that transition of power look?
I think you are speaking of the transfer of power for the technicians when there is our politicians. And the thing is, I'm not sure if we fully appreciate the strength of the technicians in the field, particularly in the public service, and the incredible importance of actually having the support of those technicians to your political agenda. So you have persons who would have either been engaged from a career standpoint or a contract standpoint, and whether they will be in support or requested or denied to support the incoming political agenda. So you actually do see some changes happening. As Senator Barry would have mentioned, we've seen relatively peaceful changes. Now, some of us who've been in the public service, we have experienced through looking at it, seeing it happen in real time, that some persons are not necessarily so peaceful about decisions that have been made for them. But at the end of the day, I think we as Bahamian people, we should be appreciative of relatively how peaceful it is compared to other countries, the transition between administrations, different parties. Because if we were to compare other developing countries in line with our realities, we're pretty much peaceful. I mean, we see what goes on in other countries around the world when there's a change in political administration. My goodness, it almost seems like a comedy happening or a drama. In some cases, it becomes very violent, actually. But we haven't had that experience, and I think that's something we should be very grateful for.
Mm. I'll add one thing to what DeAndra said. One key difference in the U.S. system to the Bahamas system, we follow the British, parliamentary system, and so there isn't that period of transition between an election to an inauguration where there is a transition that's facilitated. So in the U.S., there's time for everyone who perhaps will enter new positions within the administration. There's a transition of documents, of knowledge, etc. But in the Bahamas, literally, when the votes are counted and a new party wins, the government changes absolutely automatically. And so I think that's where the jokes come in. Leave your car parked at the office, leave your keys. And I do think that's an important difference, because literally if you are the minister of whatever today, literally tomorrow that will not be your position. And so, you being allowed entry into an office to access government documents and files, is in many cases may not be permitted. And so that's a key difference.
And one thing that wasn't so smooth, let me pull that back. One thing that caused disruption in the digital space was when former President Barack Obama walked in, and at the Capital One Arena, there were loud boos. And I don't know, that was something that was new to me, not only for the United States of America, but also here in the Bahamas for a leader to walk in, or a former leader to walk in and you boo them. And the same thing happened for former President Bill Clinton. Yes, and his wife. So when you saw that, what were your reactions to that?
Disappointed but not surprised, I think sums it up. President Trump and Hillary Clinton have almost been like the Hatfields and the McCoys politically. And I think that's always been clear for the world to see. And he's always made it a point of antagonizing Barack Obama, sort of throw him under the bus, cast blame here and there. And that sort of propaganda, I suppose, stuck with the Republicans. You're not going to be a two-term Democratic president that's been, ridiculed publicly by the person that is now the president, walk into a room full of Republicans and expect anybody to stand, clap, and cheer, and be happy that you're there. So disappointed but not surprised.
I wasn't so disappointed. I wasn't by it at all. I felt like Trump has been throwing stones at Obama for a while, and I think it's known that Obama and Trump don't like each other. There's a photo when Obama had to give power to Trump, and he's having a conversation in the Oval Office, and the look on his face is of disdain. And that's the kind of energy he has for Trump, regardless of what you saw at President Jimmy Carter's funeral, with them exchanging, cordialities. I think they just don't like each other. Obama called him a fascist, and Trump said that he wasn't American. So they have bad blood between each other. So it didn't bother me at all. It's what it is.
Good points taken. But there was also, if I read correctly, they also booed for former Vice President Mike Pence.
Yeah, of course, and that's because at the end, Mike Pence said he would not be a part of a Trump administration, and so I think Trump followers are very bitter people, and they express that very well.
Yep. And just speaking a little bit more broadly, I think that just goes to the tenor of the entire election. If we're being honest, it was very polarizing. It was very divisive. And so that's, I think, just the state of play and the state of politics in the United States. Some people would have expected Trump's speech to be more of unity, trying to bring the country together, but that's not, necessarily what came out in that speech. Trump sort of doubled down on absolutely everything he said during the election season. And so as leader, that's sort of his signal to the rest of his sort of followers and cohort as to where things will go.
Speaking of, sorry, go ahead, Mitch.
To piggyback on what Barry said, I happened to be sitting around listening to two gentlemen talk the other day, and they were talking about how they think Donald Trump is a serious fella. He's all business, no smiling, no kiki, and nothing like that. And that's interesting because when you look at his speech, he did something that most presidents don't do in their inauguration speech, and he went straight into outlining his policy. It was almost as though he was letting people know off the rip, this is everything I said I was going to do, and now I'm here. I told you I was going to be president. Now I'm here. Let me remind you, I'm going to do these things. He's sort of putting everybody back on notice, like, don't you forget. And sure enough, the executive orders pop up. And so far, I give him credit for his consistency and commitment. He's signed everything that he said he was going to sign. It's all gone according to his plan, basically.
Speaking of his speech, I want to pull some lines from that speech. And after he established protocol, he says, the golden age of America begins right now. Our country will flourish and be respected again all over the world. We will be the envy of every nation, and we will not allow ourselves to be taken advantage any longer during every single day of the Trump administration. Simply put, America first. Goes on to say, our sovereignty will be reclaimed. Our safety will be restored. The scales of justice will be rebalanced. The vicious, violent, and unfair weaponization of the Justice Department and our government will end. And our top priority will be to create a nation that is proud, prosperous, and free. I return to the presidency confident and optimistic that we are at the start of a thrilling new era of national success. A tide of changes sweeping the country. Sunlight is pouring over the entire world, and America has the chance to seize this opportunity like never before. But first, we must be honest about the challenges we face. While they are plentiful, they will be annihilated by this great momentum. Those are some powerful words.
Talk about somebody with a God complex. Wow.
But listen, way before I was a senator, I was a scholar of politics. I studied political science at the undergraduate level, and quite frankly, a political junkie. And for me, that was a masterful political speech.
I agree.
He spoke of nationalism, patriotism. He brought excitement to the arena. He made Americans feel proud. And regardless of what side of the aisle you're on, I'm not American, so I don't have a stake in the race on either side. But I think we have to admit that was a masterful political speech of an incoming president. Perhaps it didn't draw in the language of unity as many would have wanted. But again, Trump continued to do what he has done on the campaign trail and sort of reclaiming America back. I don't think there was a doubt for many people that America had gone or left anywhere, but for his political purposes, that was his language. And I want to talk a little bit about the nationalism and the populism. I might get, beaten for the comment I'm about to make, but if you close your eyes, that speech could almost be the speech of any prime minister, incoming prime minister of a newly liberated nation. So Lyndon Pinlin could have easily said that speech when Donald Trump talked about the sunlight coming back in, reclaiming, the greatness of the nation, Americans first. He really did speak the language of liberation. Now, there's another discussion as to whether, that's farce or folly or necessary in the American context. But the themes of his political campaign, you can definitely see continued in that inauguration speech.
Nicholas, you were going to say something, or were you just deep in
I
thought?
I was trying to control my facial expressions because it's funny that Barry says that. You're right. So Lyndon could have given that speech. Any world leader could have given that speech, but only in the right circumstances. If you look at what Lyndon transitioned into versus what Trump has transitioned into, scary enough, I think that they're thinking some of the same things. The audience may be a little bit different. The times may be different, but I think the common thought denominator still exists. What is always most interesting about all of Trump's speeches, and I mean, I'm not pledging myself to be a Trump fan by any degree, but what's always most interesting about his speeches is the way that he uses very simple language to talk to the people in America that he thinks have been forgotten, or who he thinks think they have been forgotten. His base is businessmen, billionaires, and then I'm not sure what to classify them as. I'll use the most politically correct term, but the lower socioeconomic group that are not black. Let's call a spade, and he garners that support really, really well. So any of them that were sitting anywhere in the middle of Wichita with their rifles and moonshine, listening to that speech, probably feel like the strongest of the strong Americans right now. So good job with that one. He's cemented his position with that, with his voters and his supporters.
Before you go any further in the discussion, I just want to point out the numbers from election. We have those on hand, and according to AP, 10%, this is 10% of Americans that are black registered to vote. 16% of those black voters for Trump. 83 of them voted for Kamala. Now we're going into the Hispanic numbers, which is 10% of the voting populace. 43% of them voted for Trump, which in 2020, he got 32%. 55% of those voters voted for Kamala. Now we're going to go into the Caucasian. Is that a demographic? Caucasian, or do I say white? Okay.
Feel free to say white.
Okay. 75% of them make up the voting population in the United States. 56% of them voted for President Trump. 42% voted for Vice President Kamala Harris. And 5% make up other races. 41% voted for President Trump. 55% voted for former Vice President Kamala Harris. Tony, what do you think about those numbers, and it also basically, and his speech as well? Because Nicholas mentioned his base.
Yeah, and what Nicholas mentioned is right. With the rifle and the moonshine is crazy though. I wouldn't say that, but rural Americans generally are. Sorry, Nick. I'm sorry. Yeah. No. Rural Americans are generally poor. They come from lower income households, and so when you're looking in this center of America, someplace in Kansas or maybe someplace in North or South Dakota or whatever, Trump knows exactly how to talk to those people. Those are the people that make up his base. He uses simple language to captivate them and get them electrified. And so his speech was great. I agree with the senator and I agree with Mitch, but I also think that Trump's base is very easily moved by his words. He doesn't have to say much in order to get them riled up. They get riled up if he says "a." And so, even though it was a great speech, I do think that his base is easily riled up.
I want to play devil's advocate here, DeAndra. Barry mentioned that could be a speech a prime minister could have said. And looking at his base, the numbers, President Donald Trump has a very strong support here in the Bahamas. Do you think that his support is garnered because of the fact that he's such a nationalist, and a lot of our Bahamians share the same view as him?
The thing is I'm always amazed at how much support other world leaders have by our own Bahamian population. And then when you look for that same support for our local leaders, it's almost like, where's the similarity, right? So that's the first thing I want to say out the gate. Secondly, I think, again, the point was made by Nick, that type of language and that part of the speech, talking about, raising pride in your country and things like that, that could have been made by almost any world leader, but the importance is the context in which it was made. When you look at the surrounding language and other parts of that speech, I think, I'm not sure if every Bahamian would have agreed with the entirety of the speech. There are portions that they may have resonated with, but not the entirety of it. Because when you're speaking about the gender concept, because that was also mentioned inside there, where the US of A will only now recognize two genders. I mean, will every Bahamian or every person around the world agree with that? Again, that's a very highly political subject that a lot of us are still exploring within our national context. Then you have other elements that he mentioned, such as the American society will now be considered colorblind. And we all know what he's referencing there with affirmative action and removing those sorts of things. Then there was a specific mention, when you have a world leader making specific mention to the elimination of radical political theories. And we all know, again, what he's talking about within the American context. You mentioned just then about the numbers of the different races, their election registration, as well as their turnout. A lot of what he was speaking to in that speech of his were relating to them. But when you look at who makes up the majority are the ones making the decision. But I think also what we need to include, and Barry mentioned this before, we have differences in how we vote, how we operate from a government standpoint. And one of those things that I think we need to really keep in mind when you have a president speaking about these things is that we are different. We are governed differently. And so some of the things that he had mentioned, how does that look? And I know it sounds a bit that I'm rambling, but I really just want to get to the point about those executive orders. He made a lot of strong points yesterday, but it's also about how does an executive order actually come into action? Those have to be proven as lawful by the government. And he actually has the governance of all the branches right now. So what does that look like in the coming days? And jumping right back into the demographics that were represented, a lot of those orders impact them. Mm-hmm. So what's going to happen in the future? And so the residents within our Bahamian people, it's very scary if they do resonate with some portions of that. And you being the devil's advocate, I'll say what I think we should be talking about. A lot of Bahamians do have negative feelings about other types of people living in their spaces. We are known to be a xenophobic people. And I think it's, the easier that we make our conversations that, we do have persons in our society who is xenophobic. That happens on the daily. So it's, yes, some of us will resonate with that. And that's we have to do some deep soul searching because we are very confused people when it comes to that, considering our historical makeup, our own background. But outside of xenophobia, really the language that was also used by Trump, and I think we all made some comments on it, when you have a population that has been essentially kept without proper education to be used by those in power, then you benefit from that power. Is that not a corruption of that power? We see populist leaders, as Barry had mentioned, they use simplified language to seem as though they are on par with the people to whom they're speaking, without actually drawing attention to the fact that they are not.
I agree. They are. One thing that I did notice, to your point right there, in terms of them trying to connect with the people, is the fact that he segued into the statement about Dr. Martin Luther King and making the dream a reality, he married all of that together with the fact that he had these groundbreaking numbers with the minority groups, Hispanic and Black. And what was interesting was when he said that we will make Dr. King's dream a reality in his speech. Tony, what are your thoughts on that?
To have the inauguration on Dr. Martin Luther King Day, to me is, that's insane. I think it should be federally recognized to the point where there should be no events, not even an inauguration. This is the second time that this has happened. The first time it happened under President Bill Clinton, going into his second term in 1997. And so, him talking about Dr. Martin Luther King and recognizing Dr. King, I'm okay with that. I'm great. If he hadn't mentioned him at all, I think, everybody would have a problem after that. And so, I'm good with him talking about Dr. Martin Luther King and his impact. But at the same time, I did have a bad feeling about the inauguration taking place on Dr. Martin Luther King Day, even though it's not Dr. King's birthday itself. Still, the day recognized should be left alone, in my opinion.
That's a great point.
I will add something to this. I do think when we're talking about MLK Day, we have to mention the fact that MLK Day is a day that celebrates civil rights and equality. But as DeAndra is pointing out, many of the initiatives that Trump would have enacted on Inauguration Day goes against that message. And so while rhetorically he was able to sort of connect those two, as I said, in a very masterful way, when you kind of peel back the layers of the speech, you see a lot of civil rights perhaps being taken away from the American people, whether it's in relation to race, immigration, gender, sex, things like that. Those are things that Trump, is intending to strip away. Again, things he said throughout the campaign, but I think it's important just to recognize what many Americans are calling a controversy. So although he was able to sort of marry it rhetorically in his speech, there is sort of a gap or a lacuna between that rhetoric and the actions that were affected on that day.
Great point, gentlemen. Tony, just hold that right there. I want to get on the ground view from our Jerome Sawyer. He's executive producer here at Our News. He is there in Washington, D.C., weathering the weather to make sure that Our News is everywhere and we bring you the information first back here in the Bahamas. Mr. Sawyer, how are you?
Very cold. Actually, we're inside the Bahamian consulate office getting ready to shoot, so it is warm here. But the city is very, very frigid, and it has been for the past few days. But other than that, I'm well. We build Fort tough in this business, and we do what we got to do to get it done.
Mr. Sawyer, what was your experience yesterday? You were at the Capital One Arena. What was that like? Take us through from that morning, what was going on the ground to the point where you got in that arena. And also, of course, we have to know, what was your experience like hearing them boo Democratic representatives?
So first of all, we arrived in the area about 6 a.m. yesterday morning. It was probably about 10 degrees when we arrived. It probably went up another 10. We stood in line for 4 hours. Literally from 6:30 until 10:30 to get into the arena. So it gives you an idea of the amount of people that were trying to get in. Then we had to go through security checks. There's a pretty funny story. By the time we got to the gate, they told us we couldn't take some stuff in. I literally almost fell apart. I was shivering, annoyed, tired. And luckily my team was there to keep it all together to get us inside. We had to split the team at one point just because we had other priorities. But being in that space was surreal. This is my third inauguration. I covered Obama's first inauguration and Biden's inauguration 4 years ago. So the experience itself was not new to me, but under a Republican president, it was new. Being in the Maga crowd was, again, surreal. I stood, sat, listened, and in many instances just smiled because it was difficult for me to process in many ways. For instance, a lot of what we call the conspiracy theories that Trump and many of his allies have been floating were real to them, to that crowd. They spoke of They spoke of so many things from as far back as COVID and Fauci. They spoke about, the outgoing president, and then when Hillary Clinton came up, lock her up, lock her up. They booed insistently and consistently when any member of the Democratic Party was shown in that video at the rotunda. So what we were doing was, while we were in the Capitol one, we were viewing what was happening in the rotunda. So as the various presidents arrived, so they booed Obama, they booed Clinton, but what was even surprising to me is they booed George Bush. And again, it's just a part of, for me, what I see as a complete reversal to what the Republican Party was, and all of those people who represent the Republican Party of old. It was almost, we stayed there for the entire day, and we were there when the president arrived along with his family and the first lady. And it was more as if the king entered the room. It was not a presidential welcome for me. It was almost, and I said to a colleague, it's like the emperor has arrived. And so there is a huge amount of support and belief in everything that he has said. They are absolutely and unequivocally believing that America has turned the corner as of yesterday. And all of the things that he was outlining, all of his executive orders and all of the changes that he was about to make, one by one, at some point, we couldn't even hear him from the applause and the cheers. And so you have a group who are very hopeful and who are very optimistic, and the bar is extremely high for their expectations. And we're even going to run a story later on in the week where we interviewed a supporter who talked about making Canada the next state, taking over Greenland, and just some of these, crazy things, I call them, that they are absolutely 100% in support of and believe will happen. And then, for instance, when he talked about pulling out from the Paris Accord, and the cheers and the excitement that came along with that, and there were just so many things to me, again, as a journalist, I just found unsettling in some ways, because I had never really faced into it. I've reported on it, I've seen it, but to be a part of it was surreal, and that's the word that I was describing it as all day. It was an experience I will never ever forget. I stood and sat with that crowd for many long hours yesterday, and I got a better understanding though. I haven't been able to quite explain it fully, but I can see why there is this movement towards Trump. There's a lot of frustration in America with the way that things are. And I think that I recognized more than anything else yesterday.
Jerome, before we let you go, because we know that you have to record, and thank you so much for that exclusive that's about to be coming out later this week.
I definitely watch tonight and the rest of the week. We have some very interesting. I mean, we even ran across the Proud Boys at one point. They were demonstrating outside today. Yeah, we had a little pullback with somebody in the crowd from in my team. It was a Proud Boys situation. And again, you think you're a black Bahamian, you've never seen this. And they're yelling and screaming white power, white supremacy. And it was that moment, I think, particularly where one of our technical guys was just in shock as to what was happening. He'd never faced into that. And someone literally had to do a let's go. But yeah, sorry, you were about to ask a question.
That's fine. That's great information, and it's also nerve-wracking as well. It reminds me of the first time I saw a Confederate flag. So that feeling it never sits very well with you, no matter where you're from. But I want to make sure that I had this fact correctly that I mentioned earlier in the show, and that was, did the crowd boo former Vice President Mike Pence?
Yes, they did. Yes. There was a loud boo for him. Very loud.
And lastly, you covered President Barack Obama's inauguration. President Barack Obama was the first black president of the United States. You mentioned how royal the crowd was for President Trump. Was it nearly the same for President Barack Obama?
It was different in that I think his election was more about, for a lot of people at the time, it was more about a feeling of hope, a feeling of achievement, a feeling of we have broken a barrier, we have done the impossible by electing the first Black president. And I'll tell you, one of the things that was very different this time around was the diversity of the spectators. So yesterday and even the day before, because we attempted to cover the victory rally on Sunday, it was the ratio of minorities to me was less than 1% in the crowd that I saw over the past 2 days, especially yesterday. When I was here for Obama's first inauguration, it was as if the world converged on Washington in terms of race, nationality, orientation. It was just very, very different. And I will even hasten to say that during that period, everywhere you went, there was that feeling of hopefulness, and it was almost as if the whole city was in a love fest. People were just happy to see you, happy to be here, and I got a much different feeling that time. 4 years ago was a lot scarier with Biden's administration. January 6th had just come in. We were still in the midst of, January 6th had just happened. We were still in the midst of COVID. So there was a lot of fear and anxiety and trepidation within the city, and there was limited movement. But there was a stark difference in the temperature of the crowd during Obama's first inauguration and what I witnessed this weekend.
Thank you so much for that, Mr. Sawyer, for that information on the ground. It truly means so much. We hope you guys stay safe, stay warm, and we will see you later on in this evening's broadcast.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and great conversation. Sorry I can't stay around for the rest of it, but duty calls. I've got more stuff to do, but thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Before we get into the executive orders to our panelists, I want to know very briefly your thoughts on what Mr. Sawyer just shared with us.
Well, as a former photojournalist and journalist, I think it's awesome and cool that he's there and he's going through the experience. Even if there are some things that are startling or some things that are terrifying, that's what the job calls for, and these are the moments that you live for. So my first impression is that it's cool. The other thing is that, when it comes to Trump, I'm never really surprised at how extreme things can be. And so just hearing Mr. Sawyer express what's happening there on the ground is not surprising at all. It kind of makes me smile and chuckle that he's having that experience, but I'm sure this will be something that he remembers for the rest of his life, and I think it's pretty cool.
For the sake of levity, can I just say there is powerful irony in the fact that the Proud Boys are outside chanting white power. Oh my goodness.
I think to echo what Nick had said earlier, it's almost as though this was one of those cases where it's not surprising. Mm-hmm. It was not surprising. I mean, you would always hope for something different, but truly not surprising. Now, again, compared to his initial, his first inauguration, this time it was more, I feel, more expressive. I'll leave it at that.
Older, certainly older.
Yeah.
Barry?
Yeah, just echoing the thing that everyone is saying, that it's not surprising. We've watched the campaign, we've heard the rhetoric, we've seen who the supporters are, and so while it's unfortunate, it's not surprising that would be the experience for a Black person there. But on the flip side of things, just wanted to point out, I've obviously personally been involved in politics, and so I know the feeling when your party wins. I also know the feeling when your party loses, and so hearing Jerome talk about the excitement and the joy that the Democrats had when Obama won, now that the Republicans are having that Trump has won, and then the difference in sort of crowd. I think those of us who are involved in politics in the Bahamas, we feel the same thing. There's some famous pictures of people in the PLP headquarters literally look like their belly breaking down when we lost in 2017. And similarly, there are pictures of former F&M cabinet ministers when they found out that they lost this last election. And so that's part and parcel of politics in a democracy. You win some, you lose some, you regroup. But that feeling of joy, or that feeling of sort of hurt is there, depending on, who you supported.
Well, one thing President Donald Trump was very much excited to do was sign these executive orders. He did stick to his word, so much so that before he left the Capital One Arena, he signed one executive order before he left and went to the White House. It is reported that he signed roughly 200 executive actions, memoranda, and proclamations on his first day in office, including, and that is clemency for January 6 offenders and defendants. That was the riot that happened, that Mr. Sawyer alluded to. 1,500 pardons, and commuted the sentences of 14 of his supporters in connection with January 6, 2021, the attack on the U.S. Capitol. Another order that he signed to was also concerning birthright, citizenship at birthright. Now that is a big one.
That one gonna hurt Bahamians.
Yeah, I don't know if it will though, because as DeAndra said earlier, you can sign 200,000 executive orders if you want to, but they have to be lawful. So clemency in the U.S. is sort of a nuanced branch of presidential powers in the law. So I won't go too far with that. He can do what he wants. He can pardon who he wants. He might free Diddy. Who knows? But the whole birthright, there are people that are going to be naturally displaced by that. 30 days is a short window for compliance or for that to end. And I mean, I'd like to believe that there's some shred of America that still believes in the justice that's enshrined in their constitution. Rolls eyes. And, a successful challenge to that may just be the fact that it's going to displace more citizens. It's going to result in some economic concerns because you're going to have to figure out how to get the people that are there or who may not have crossed that threshold, whatever it is, out, relocated, whatever it is. I just can't see that being sustainable. So, if you still want to go have your baby in Miami, I would say wait 6 months to a year and you'd probably be good.
I just want to, before we go any further to next point, I just want to point out that when he was signing a lot of those executive orders, the press were asking him, do you think that it'll go through the Supreme Court? And he said, I'm confident it will. So I just want to make sure.
The Supreme Court in his favor, so there's that.
Yeah. And so that's what I kind of wanted to point out between the kind of system of law and how we operate here in the Bahamas and how they operate in the United States. So, as Nick said, these are executive orders. As president, he can do as he wish, and many presidents have signed executive orders that were later found to be unconstitutional or illegal. Here's my thing: in the short term, people will be displaced and marginalized. And so that is an effect that, it's going to have on Bahamians, Caribbean, any population around the world of people who, have their kids in the U.S., in particular the Mexican and Latin American population, who, may be undocumented. And so they live in the U.S. They may have been born in the U.S., but they don't necessarily have U.S. citizenship. And so that's going to affect that population. Now, in the United States, law is adjudicated by judges who are appointed essentially by the president. Even upstream in the U.S. courts, they're elected, and so many of these, judges have clear political leanings. In fact, on the Supreme Court, it's clear who are the conservative or liberal liberal justices. So right now, the Supreme Court leans conservative, and so I think Trump is correct in saying that, hey, if this goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, it's likely that they will uphold it. Also, we don't know when the case will make it, if any, make it to the Supreme Court, but he has 4 years as president. If there's any more movement in that Supreme Court and he gets to appoint even just one more justice, that's a case in which a lot of, conservative leaning cases may actually pass in the Supreme Court. It may take, years or decades down the line for these things to be sorted out.
Barry, while we still have you here, and I want to go to Tony and DeAndra, while I have you talking, I want to touch on this small point right here, and that is the tariff increase that he's trying to do. And also in his speech, he said, "Drill, baby, drill," because what he wants to do is really begin to cut out the middleman in the United States. What is your thoughts on that, and how does it affect us here in the Bahamas?
Yeah. Well, as you know, one of my roles in the government is chairman of the Bahamas Trade Commission. So I speak very openly about the Bahamas diversifying its trade. And for one of the reasons is sort of ensuring that we are able to move in an environment where other countries are, making policies like these. And so he, on the campaign trail, insisted that he's going to increase tariffs on American goods. Well, that may have mixed effects in the Bahamas. We don't know exactly how it will affect the Bahamas. But one of the things we can expect is that for certain products and services from the United States may perhaps be more expensive. And so that's one way that's going to affect us here in the Bahamas. And so we are, watching that very closely to see what industries, what goods are targeted and how that's going to affect the Bahamas. But a lot of the policies enacted by Trump are going to have huge international effects, not just for the Bahamas, but for the Caribbean and the global community at large. And so I think as a government and as a country, we have to keep abreast of these things. When he says America first, that's America first, which means all the rest of us are going to come second, third, fourth, and fifth. And so even as we're discussing that, we have to, a lot of Bahamians were very close to the U.S., but we have to understand we're not America, and these policies, while affecting America in a particular way, may have the reverse effect on our small economy.
Tony, I want to ask you, because when he was signing those executive orders, he also stated that a lot of these things are people wanted to do long time, or it was supposed to be done long time. That was he kept on repeating certain things, and that was one of the things that he repeated. And when I think about the whole Birthright law, and then he's ending the open border policy, and then the cartel being recognized as a terrorist group now, do you think that a lot of past presidents, or some past presidents, some governors that are in the United States, tried to do these things but didn't have the confidence in his words to do them?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when it comes to birthright citizenship, which I benefit from, by the way. I know for certain, that's a part of the 14th Amendment, and it's in place because shortly after slavery, slaves weren't given citizenship when they were born on the soil, and so that's where that is rooted. And just knowing that, there's gonna be some difficulty in getting that through, but at the same time, like, the panel has said, he does have the Supreme Court in his favor, and he has set it up this way the first term, and I think strategically for a second term. And so, I'm definitely not surprised that he's doing all this. I definitely think it's an uphill battle with the birthright citizenship, and he's always going to, like the panel said, he's always going to put America and his base first before anybody else.
One person that he has in his favor is Elon Musk. And speaking of Elon Musk, now he owns the platform X. Other persons that attended the inauguration yesterday was Mark Zuckerberg and, of course, Mr. Jeff Bezos. But these two gentlemen own two of the biggest digital platforms in the world. And one thing that Trump is set out to sort of save is TikTok. And in his executive orders, he gave them a 75-day extension. What do you think his process is on that in terms of trying to save TikTok, the same TikTok that has been accused of trying to steal information from Americans?
So I think Trump has been very clear on his views on TikTok. First, he wanted to ban TikTok. Then he joined TikTok, amassed, millions of followers. And, it's reported that TikTok helped him to win over the youth vote. And so he's very open and clear in saying that, hey, I was against TikTok until it helped me. Now I think it's useful. I want to find a way to save it. But what's also interesting, in signing the executive orders yesterday, he very openly discussed that TikTok must partner with an American company or sell itself or its American operations to an American company, and that's the only way he'll approve a TikTok deal. And so it'll be very interesting to see the stance that TikTok takes in this. But we see the CEO of TikTok, as all of these other tech giants, as you indicated, getting very close and chummy to the Trump administration. And so it'll be very interesting to see how that process goes. But Joe Biden in his farewell address to the American people, he talked about the creation of this sort of new oligarchy that's sort of forming. And he meant, the fact that these people who have tremendous influence over information, not just for Americans, but for the world, they're all sort of coalescing around Trump now, and the effect that would likely have on America, but also the world.
Now, one thing that does affect us, and DeAndra, I want to get your thoughts on this. You did speak to the executive order that was signed in regards to gender, that there will be only 2 genders recognized in the United States. I want to discuss the fact that he wants to pull out of the agreement with Paris on climate change and also the World Health Organization. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so 3 things that automatically come to mind. During his first presidency, he did withdraw from the Paris Agreement. So I think this isn't unprecedented. We've seen it happen before. Those of us in countries that are immediately impacted by climate change, this is again very concerning. We also see where he's mirrored activities with regards to the United Nations and some of their actions that will be taken there. That's also very concerning. Some of those actions, however, we must be fair where we can and note that those actions, such as the payment of dues, etc., at the UN, which is quite reliant on, the United States has not been subsidizing that organization as much as it can be. When it comes to the proposals on gender, I expect that there's going to be pushback from within those states. Actually, I was doing some research in real time just then. As of today, there has been a coalition of about 18 Democratic attorney generals that has sued on the attempt of Trump through executive order to effect the birthright citizenship change. And so that was actually filed in a district that will go to an appeals court that's in Massachusetts. So that's Democratic judge dominated. So it's very strategic what some of them are actually doing. And so I perceive that we are going to see a lot of the Democratic states doing what they can to push back automatically. Speaking on the amendment that we need to pay attention to with the birthright, that's actually going after the Constitution of the United States of America. That's the 14th Amendment. And it almost as though when you hear the rhetoric behind who or who should not be allowed citizenship, while there may be support on the grounds of that, the reality that your constitution can then be changed so easily, based off of a whim or the thoughts of a particular section of society, that's very concerning, because what's going to stop any other part of that document that governs your entire country and has done so for how many years? What's going to stop that from happening? I just wonder, in time we're going to see what happens, but obviously what's going on today with the lawsuit being filed, we're going to see lots more of those, because speaking on gender, there are certain states that are heavily in support of that. There are some states that are heavily in opposition to that. So we're going to possibly be seeing even more strict lines, those deviations and differences from federal law to state law. And we've already seen the confusion that happens with that. That have already occurred with abortion rights. And the rates that have skyrocketed with women who have been either seriously injured or have been, unfortunately, who have died because of those things. Now, I'm not saying obviously that's not going to happen with birthright things and such, but these are serious challenges that are happening already. So when those pushbacks happen, we should look at them. We should see what's going on. We should follow their progress. But at the same time, as Barry has said, very rightfully so, our legal structures, our government structures are very different, but they still do impact us. They impact us greatly because they influence our people. They influence not only the persons that are in positions of power, but they also influence our populace. So we should keep a close watch on that, because international relations and regional activities, they almost not directly result from what's going on in developed countries, but they are heavily influenced. That's more so what I want to look at. I want to see what's going to happen with us as a Caribbean region with Trump as president. And we cannot use what happened during his first term as a sole benchmark. We cannot.
One thing that will impact us directly, is it has not been confirmed as yet. One of you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but we are anticipated to receive a U.S. ambassador. Trump has suggested a name, and that is Herschel Walker. That's the name that's floating around. He's a strong supporter of Trump, which means if he's a strong supporter of Trump, then Trump's ideologies comes here with him. What are your thoughts on on us having a U.S. ambassador during this Republican Party?
If I could jump in really quickly on that, because I think the conversation we should just preface. The Bahamas hasn't had an ambassador in how long? Through how many administrations? So
Blankenship, probably.
Person we may have issues with. The fact that there is a president willing to appoint an ambassador here and not relegate our country to a charge d'affaires, I think that should be respected. Now, the person we may have issues with, but we've been needing an ambassador for quite some time. And I have this conversation with folks very often. If a country does not deem you important enough to send you an ambassador, then you need to take a closer look at what is the quality of those relations. We've been functioning with the charge d'affaires for years and been told that that is okay. And while they may have functioned in the role as an ambassador, the very fact that they were not appointed as such, that's a direct reflection of our relationship with that other country. I'll stop there because I know everybody has something to say about it.
I'm sort of in I have to see it. I have to see it happen. I don't actually think that that's going to be something that happens. I feel like he's just saying things, that sound good. He's trying to reward somebody who he feels has been, well, not who he feels has been, who's been I guess, staunch supporter of his along the way. But, I can't. Speaking for me, I can't really see the value in having Herschel Walker here as an ambassador. I agree with DeAndra. It's been 3 administrations, maybe 4 administrations of pure insult that we haven't had a U.S. ambassador. Considering that, they always like to tout the cooperation between the U.S. and the Bahamas and the friendly nature of our diplomatic relationships and this and that and the next. But I need to see it happen. I'm not going to. I won't beat him with the same stick that I'll necessarily beat Trump. I appreciate that brings his policies with him. But the optimist in me thinks that if there is a benefit, maybe now would be the time we would see it after 3 administrations of not having one in place. So, let's see what happens. But if I could, I wanted to touch on something DeAndra said about the executive orders with respect to the Paris Agreement on climate change. There's a long game argument that I think gets left out of the public discourse, and that is that, we know Donald Trump doesn't care about the climate, or about climate change, I should say. But the Paris Agreement also has provisions in it for what I believe are termed climate refugees, which necessarily would encompass basically the entire CARICOM region, because there's going to come a point, sea levels rise, place gets hot, we're eventually going to find that we'll be displaced. Maybe not within our respective time on this earth, but certainly it's become an inevitability now. And someone said to me that one of the reasons Donald Trump is so keen on keeping the U.S. away from the Paris Agreement is to cut off another channel through which people can migrate to the U.S. And assimilate, or I think assimilate is the wrong word, to matriculate into American society and become Americans. So that's less of a point and more of something I would just drop, for everybody to sort of consider. But I thought it was interesting to consider it in that context.
Tony, let me get your thoughts on that, and Barry, I want to save you last.
Yeah, I really don't have any thoughts on that. I want to go back to what we were talking about as far as assigning an ambassador as well, and I agree with Ms. Cartwright over there. I do think that the Bahamas does have leverage when it comes to our geographical location, and so I definitely think that Herschel Walker would be an ambassador here. Over there, in the Bahamas, just for that purpose alone. And the senator can correct me if I'm wrong with that.
No. Your point is valid. While I agree with DeAndra, I have a slightly different view. I do think that a country appointing an ambassador to another country, in many ways, shows the priority that the appointing country has in relation to their agenda and the country the ambassador is being appointed to. So I do agree with that as a premise. However, I think it should be noted that the Bahamas and the United States has an extremely strong diplomatic and economic relationship. As it relates to the US, it's perhaps also one of the easiest relationships. It's not a tumultuous jurisdiction or region where if you don't have sort of someone at the ambassadorial level, things will get crazy, so to speak. So the last ambassador we would have had, I think, would have been Nicole Avant, that was appointed under Obama in his first term. Since then, we haven't had a U.S. ambassador, but I think the relationship between the U.S. and the Bahamas has remained quite steady, as DeAndra would have said. The charge d'affaires that would have represented the U.S. over that time, they've assumed the office and continued the U.S. relationship. I know that there had been a few nominees that Obama and Trump and Biden would have suggested to the Bahamas, but they didn't pass congressional or Senate approval. I think ambassador appointments have to be approved by Senate. I know one or two of them were rejected. And so it's not necessarily the case that the US hasn't tried to appoint ambassadors, but a lot of the choices of the presidents were rejected. And so me personally, I wouldn't read too much into the fact that there hasn't been an ambassador, but I do like the fact that Trump almost has the Bahamas as a priority from day one in terms of appointing an ambassador. When the announcement came out, I know the only thing that our Ministry of Foreign Affairs would have said is that, it's a process. There's a formal process that happens where the person who is suggested to the country, and the accepting country basically has to, accept that person. And so I think at the point that announcement had been made, that formal process hadn't happened because obviously Trump wasn't in office as yet. So I think we just need to sit and wait to see if it actually happens.
It's a good point. It's a very good point. DeAndra, as you are the female on the panel, I will give you the opportunity. We do have to get in our last words and then sign off.
Okay, if you're giving me the opportunity to just follow up on what Barry said before my last words, and I'm happy to go at the end or in between the guys on the panel for those last words. I just want to say that you can, I think, just to edify all of ourselves, those who are watching as well, take a look at the list of countries to whom the US has ambassadors accredited to and to whom they do not, and you will see a similarity. You will see similarities amongst those, and you will see the curiosities that result. And I think we can see a trend, not throughout administrations, but just saying, take a look at it amongst our own CARICOM colleagues. There may be one or two that have ambassadors, but the majority do not. And we have to ask our question, our question as people.
I think that thought will definitely lead us into our next panel discussion. To all of our panelists, I hope we see you guys again when we decide to do this, as this is something that we will be doing throughout the presidency. And of course, we have our own general elections coming up as well. Once again, thank you guys so much. And thank you for watching. This has been another panel discussion, Inauguration Roundtable 2025.